You made it through the storm. Well done, well done. Lovely to see you all. I battled here from snow-blitzed Bears Den. We couldn't make it yesterday, so I hope the party went well last night. Was it good? Okay, a few survivors out there, I trust. That's excellent. Great to see you. I'm Brian Taylor. Very warm welcome to what I'm sure will be a superb event here at the Cove and Kilcreggan Festival. The event today is sponsored by partners who apparently joined forces with Heart Insurance in the last year. They're long-standing supporters of this wonderful festival. They've been with the festival since the beginnings 11 years ago, and I'm very, very grateful for their ongoing support, which I would endorse and pass on. Now, I asked you earlier whether you managed to get here. I asked you about the party last night. Here's another question to the audience. Any Beatles fans? A flock. Do you like the early happy clappy stuff, or do you like I Am the Walrus and both? Right? Who likes the happy clappy and She Loves You? Yeah. Who likes I Am the Walrus and Abbey Road? The hippies! The hippies are over here, and dear. Well, anyone? Another question. This is a slightly more delicate one. Anyone remember 1963? That's it. Well done. Well, look, I definitely qualify on both counts. I'm a huge fan of the Fab Four, and I certainly remember 1963. Now, Ken McNAB is a fellow journalist and the absolute go-to expert on the Fab Four. He's already introduced us in books to the Beatles in Scotland and to the last days of the group. That one was titled And in the End. Recognise it? Yeah, the Abbey Road fans will recognise it. If you do, you're definitely a star for that as well. The latest book, I've got it here. The latest book is superb. It really is a good one. Shake It Up, Baby, The Rise of Beatlemania and the Mayhem of 1963. So it tells the story of that quite amazing period, quite incredible period as they really, really hit the top and above all perhaps broke into the American market. It's a superb tale, and I've read the other books as well. It's a great book, great narrative. It's extremely well researched, but at the same time, it's a story, it's a narrative, it's an exciting story with, cliffhangers at the end of chapters as to what's going to happen next, and a problem has arisen, how they're going to tackle it. Ken, that presumably was the objective you were welcome, by the way. That presumably was the objective you were going for, a narrative rather than an academic text.
Yeah, first of all, just to say thanks to everybody for coming along this morning. I appreciate that. And I was trying to, there's so many books about the Beatles, right? And you're always of that view, does the world need another one?
Yeah.
But with And in the End, I thought there was a lot of drama happened during that last year. And so to take it as on a month-by-month basis,
yeah.
And it's amazing. It's like throwing ripples. I mean, first of all, it's a great story.
Yeah.
For my mind, if I take you back to the beginning slightly, you become a fan of the music, and somebody asked, does anybody remember 1963? Well, I have to say, hand on heart, no, I don't.
No.
Because I wasn't here.
No, neither.
But you start off with that sort of base camp, if you like, which is the music. And as a youngster, I quite liked the band. But as you get a bit older and a bit more aware, then when you start to drill down into the actual story of the band, from a journalistic point of view, it's a great story, and it remains a great story.
I mean, the one thing I was struck by, many things I was struck by, but I mean, there'll be some here that they won't remember 1963 for the same reason they don't remember last night's party. But that's a different point indeed. But one thing I was struck by, the extent of touring they did. I mean, Epstein had them going. Brian Epstein, the manager, had them going night after night to Wigan and then London and then Scotland. It was all over.
The whole thing, if you look at
never stopped.
If you look at it for that entire period of 63 to 70,
yeah.
I had to write this down because man of a certain vintage, and it's something like you've got 18 UK singles, 13 UK albums, you've got 6 UK tours, 3 United States tours. Tours including Australia and New Zealand, and a couple of world tours thrown in. So
let them stop. You know, they would be touring and then they'd be going on Ready Steady Go, or they'd be going on the BBC or whatever. You know,
I mean, that period,
totally relentless.
yeah, that period from 63 to 66 is relentless. I mean, I don't know how anybody can maintain that kind of pace, but it's interesting as well, because not only did they have that body of work at that time, but somewhere in between they managed to have a private life, and Ringo even managed to have 2 kids. I don't know how he managed that, but in between all that, and John had his son as well. So it was a harum-scarum period.
Lennon complains, and you trace this in the book, that when all the screaming and shouting, the Beatlemania of which on which the book is based, he says it stopped them developing as musicians. Do you think that's true, or is that just John?
I think partly it's true, and partly it's true. I mean, to try and put it in some kind of context for you, Brian, at the start of 1963, in January 1963, they were playing up in Dingwall, and famously played to about 19 people in Dingwall. And there'll
be about 300 now that claim they were there on the night. But that's
the funny thing is, when I did the first book, I thought I would try and speak to as many people who saw them at that time. And it's well chronicled that there were only 19 people. Nowadays, if you find out there's actually 1,900 people say they were there.
Exactly.
But there were 19 people there.
We did it with our two sons, but particularly the eldest son is a huge fan. We did what could only be described as a pilgrimage to Liverpool, driving down from Glasgow and going, and everybody you met. Oh yeah, I were in a band with John back in the day. I thought, yeah, very good. What was it, the Halley Orchestra? Because it must have been a hell of a size of a band that you were in. Everybody claims to know them and remember them.
But that particular gig in Strathpeffer with 19 people there was only like 10 days before Please Please Me came out.
Oh, for goodness sake.
Right. So if you got that kind of chronology, and meanwhile up the road in the local town hall was a band called the Melatones, and there were 1,000 kids were at this gig up the road. So that just gives you an idea, a sense of the fact that they were so unknown at the beginning of January 1963. And by the time you get to October 1963, the Royal Variety performance, and they're playing at the Palladium, and there are sold out concerts, and there's that sense of Beatlemania is like a slow creep throughout 1963. But not so much by the end of 1963, but as the whole thing began to take hold, especially in America, where you literally cannot hear a word. I mean, if you've seen any of the Shea Stadium concert, they can't hear themselves in this tsunami of noise. And as musicians, although it's interesting, maybe as live musicians, but in the studio there was definitely a progression once they stopped touring and they could focus more on the music.
We'll talk about Beatlemania in a moment. Let's reflect on those shows in Scotland. They were quite astonishing, weren't they? They always claimed that they loved playing there, but I suppose that's what bands say when they're trying to ingratiate themselves. But they did seem to have a certain rapport with the audience.
I mean, when I did the first book, I thought my crazy goal was to try and speak to somebody who had been at every Scottish gig, and that includes one from 1960, before they became famous, where they played, would you believe, Alloa Town Hall, places like Dunblane, Heath, and I did quite well out of somewhat. I can't remember now, about 22 gigs. There was only one I didn't get, which I think was Forres. But again, Glasgow, they were very keen on playing in Scotland. Lennon had great ties to Scotland. He had a cousin in Edinburgh called Stan Parks, whose street I pass every Monday when I'm going to Edinburgh.
Oh boy!
And they were very tight, the 2 cousins. And Stan's family had a croft in Durness. So Lennon used to spend all his teenage holidays, summer holidays, in Durness. So he had a great affection for Scotland, Lennon especially. So they loved coming back to play in Glasgow.
He really loved it.
He definitely did. He definitely.
Way north, isn't it?
It's right at the top of up
very
there.
Tip,
so there was a definite connection for Lennon to Scotland. I mean, he went to the Edinburgh Tattoo as a teenager, things like that. He talks about this in his later years, but
John Lennon at the military tattoo.
He remembers the skirl of the pipes. But when the Glasgow, there was one Glasgow show in particular in 1963, I think it's October the 19th, whereby they played at the old Glasgow Concert Hall, not the Concert Hall as it is now, and the scenes were complete mayhem, and the city fathers at the time, what would have been Glasgow Corporation, were so dismayed by the damage. I mean, there was plaster coming off the roof, and they were so dismayed by this that they issued a ban right the next day, banning all pop groups from playing at this iconic theatre, because it was home to the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, so it was an iconic venue.
Bet they didn't get the plaster coming off.
And they said the next day this guy was puce with indignation. Puce.
You're telling us stories. Let me tell you one. I'm a Dundonian, and the guy Andy Lothian, it's ANDI by the way, he was obviously being trendy and hippie, but Andy Lothian organised the Beatles performances in Dundee. He was a Dundee music entrepreneur. My brother, who later became a very staid banker, played in a beat group at the time, and it was quite definitely a beat group. I think he played clarinet, and I think they were called the Hound Dogs. Anyway, Andy Lothian was their manager, so we knew Mr. Lothian. I know his son, Andy Jr., even better, but we knew him. He claims to have invented the phrase Beatlemania. Is there anything at all, or was it just the usual BS from
there are many claimants to this particular phrase. It was actually after that gig in Glasgow, whereby a radio reporter thrust a microphone under his nose and asked him, because he was a joint promoter of this concert with a guy called Albert Benici.
Oh, right.
And Andy's famous retort, if you believe Andy, was that don't worry, it's only Beatlemania.
Yeah.
But if you do your research, there are a couple of counterclaims. It's one of these things. I mean, this is a band that's shrouded in mystique, mystery and mythology.
And claims a bit of them as well.
Mythology, and as the years go on, then stories become legends, and legends become myth. So, but we'll give it to Andy. If Andy wants to take it to his grave as the man who invented the word Beatlemania.
The story told about Dundee is the Beatles were due to play the Palais de Danse in South Tay Street, and then somebody said to Andy, they've just released Please Me, and they're kind of a big deal now. You better book the Caird Hall. I hope they're not going to want more money, was the answer from Andy. But apparently they didn't. I think persuaded them to do it for the same rate. Tell us about Beatlemania. We talked about the origins, the near riot. I mean, it was incredible. It was incredible phenomenon, wasn't it? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it hadn't really happened before. I mean, you've got Elvis, but to me, obviously Sinatra had the Bobby Soxer and things like that. But again, looking at it through the lens of somebody who wasn't there and having to rely on the testimony, but the pictures and the newspapers tell the story quite vividly about this creep. As I say, I mean, once you had something like four singles in 1963, and by the time you get to She Loves You, this had almost become a movement in itself.
Interesting, yeah.
And the interesting thing is that how did young people at that time get their information? They could only rely on radio, and news and television was the growing medium of the age. Not everybody had a television.
No, indeed.
But television brought these four guys into your sitting room, not quite this, and there was a bit more mass exposure than there was before. And of course, everybody would, some of the older generation would tut about the length of their hair. I mean, if you see the pictures now, Brian's hair's longer than theirs. In a sense, but definitely by the time you get to October, November, and as I say, they got this royal seal of approval by appearing before the Queen.
I'm going to ask about that
God
in a minute.
bless her.
You talk about that. Here's a quote: "A point in a random sequence of inauspicious events conflated to create a chain reaction that by the end of 1963 would forever alter the contours of global culture." Now that's quite a statement. That's more than just a band of lads singing "She Loves You." Yeah. Do you think that is accurate? That it was a complete transformation of the culture?
I think they were part of a complete transformation.
That's good.
I think they were part of a complete transformation. They were part of what you might call, for argument's sake, working class chic. They were part of a group of young people who, men didn't want to dress like their fathers anymore. Top hats were out unless your name was Rees-Mogg. Top hats were out.
He took his nanny to a by-election.
Exactly.
He did. He took his nanny.
So,
went down very, very well in Glenrothes.
Young men didn't want to dress like their fathers. Young women were more empowered. They all had some more disposable income. National service had been abolished. There was a definite change of optimism in the air. And that contributed to that kind of atmosphere, if you like, a change of attitude. And while I don't think they were in the vanguard of it, they were perhaps in the crow's nest, along with that change in culture, where you've got like Terence Stamp, Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Tom Courtenay, Diana Rigg. You've got a whole load of young people in the arts and culture who are coming forth, and all of a sudden, working class was in.
Love it. I'm going to come to the audience in a minute, but I've got a couple more questions I'd like to ask. But you can get ready with questions to join in, discussions, points of view as well. Let's place it in context. 1963, you're talking Profumo, you're talking just coming up to Wilson and the white heat of technological revolution. You're talking the verge of the swinging 60s. You're talking above all, the assassination of President Kennedy. It was a turbulent time. Did they enhance that turbulence, or were they reflecting the turbulence that there was in society?
I think partly they reflected the turbulence, but young people have always been tuned into music, and I think that their emergence was really important for a lot of young people.
But they were bigger, weren't they? It was bigger, and
it was everything was bigger.
Everything was bigger.
And the newspapers suddenly realised that that if you put the Beatles on the front page, then you sold more copies. So it became
they were quite disdainful at first.
They almost by accident invented tabloid newspapers, because all these newspapers like the Mirror, the Express, I can't remember whether the Sun would have been around then, maybe. And all of a sudden, they went from this generational shift whereby pop music was taboo. You didn't canon because it was very much frowned upon. And all of a sudden, you put these guys on the front of the newspapers, and lo and behold, young people, because that's the only way they could get their information. And all of a sudden, your sales would surge significantly.
And it's a time when you're talking about the BBC was still doing the Light programme. I think Radio 1 was 67, something like that?
67, yeah.
67. So you got the Light programme. If you wanted the music that the Beatles represented, you had to go to the pirate stations. It was almost out there and dangerous. So was that part of the thinking?
But the whole thing, Brian, is rooted in the music. The whole thing is rooted in the music, and the music, as I say, is the bass. You're trying to turn bass metal into gold in a sense, and they were the ones who did it. And always, to a degree, I think this is a bit of a crude analogy, especially for a Sunday. But I always think maybe that you had Elvis as a kind of John the Baptist type figure, but then you've got these four guys who were like musical messiahs coming out of that wilderness at the time. And
You're going to get in trouble, Ken. Lennon got in a lot of trouble. Was saying we're going to be bigger than Jesus.
That John.
That John, what a lad. What a lad.
But I think, when you look at that, the wilderness of that bleak, was a bleak political landscape. You must remember, this is only 18 years after the Second World War. 18 years is nothing. But it was a significant generational shift. And it's the point, 1963, I always think it's the start of the 60s. Not 1960. I think it's 1963 is the start of the 60s. And it's a time when the world went from that sort of black monochrome into Kodachrome into a more colourful.
But musically and also culturally, the Beatles just they transplanted and they supplanted all the sort of late 50s and early 60s. Happy clappy bands just were boom, with publication of She Loves You. That was it.
Here's the thing for young people. Here's the thing for young people in 1963. Rock and roll, as it was, had withered in the vine. Elvis was in the army. Jerry Lee Lewis was in disgrace for marrying his second cousin or something like that. Chuck Berry was no longer influential, all these kind of bands. And the charts were full of this saccharine pop, like Bobby V, Bobby Vinton, Bobby Darin, Perry Como, Val Doonican.
Oh, hey, hang on a
Sorry
second.
By the way,
Perry Como, I was with you on Bobby V, but you can't hear Perry. Never.
But the chart in Acherbilk, and so it's a very anodyne landscape in a sense. And these four guys came, and not so much with Love Me Do, which is pretty standard
Yeah.
pop follow. But somehow or other, there was something visceral about Please Please Me. I mean, it sounds harmless now when you think about it, but at the time there was something visceral in that song and that first album. I always think with the first album, I'm talking about the start of the 60s, 1963, it's such a pivotal year. Obviously, Kennedy been assigned, we can talk about that.
Incredible, yeah.
But I always think if you listen to the very first album, Please Please Me, and you hear McCartney's countdown to the very first track on the very first album, where it's got that 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
and it's like, I know there weren't any Lear jets in, but it's like a jet on the runway, and that jet is heading right down that runway, and it's the most exciting.
And all the other bands probably heard it and went, oh no, no.
And it is like a chain reaction. That very first intro, and I've never forgotten. I mean, I like lots of the other stuff, but that even today, that intro still sounds.
But you describe in '63 the sound being placed on bills with American saccharine musicians, with not East Saccharine but Cliff Richard and other things like that, and they were just different, weren't they? They were just something else.
There was a hint of rebellion about them.
Right, I'm going to ask about that. Yeah.
There was a slight hint of rebellion about them. They were cheeky chappies.
Yeah.
There was that kind of working class element. Whereas Cliff was Cliff, And by the way, I do like Cliff.
Yeah.
Cliff was Cliff and squeaky clean, and he was unthreatening.
I mean, it would have been enough having a go at Perry Como was one thing, but Cliff.
Were
the Beatles part of the establishment? Who took awards from the Crown? Were they part of the establishment, or were they the cheeky? I mean, when Lennon does the Royal Varieties, in the cheap seats, clap your hands, and the rest of you rattle your jewellery. It was cheeky, but still, they're on the stage at the Royal Variety performance. It couldn't be more part of the establishment if it tried.
Well, I think it kind of backfired a wee bit. I think he, John had this acerbic edge to him, right? You're never quite sure which John Lennon you were going to get, and we all know about the difficulties in his childhood and all the rest of it.
Brought up by his aunt and
brought up by his aunt and a difficult childhood.
Chaotic at school. You describe it in the book as just a wreaking chaos at school and college.
It's well documented that he had a tough upbringing. Having said that, a tough upbringing, but we talked about this earlier, but quite a nice upbringing.
Part of Liverpool,
the working class hero thing is a bit of a myth.
No, the tenements were Ringo and George. Paul and John were in quite smart.
But in terms of being part of the establishment, it's an interesting premise, because Lennon's great rebellion was to keep his top button unshut, and Paul would always come up and. And in terms of when you get an invite to the Royal Variety performance, then that was considered at that time the pinnacle of showbiz glamour in a sense, and I think it did stick in Lennon's throat somewhat, because there was an element there was an element of being embraced by traditional showbiz norms, and I think but Ringo did say, he says, well, we're in show business, and this is show business. So I think they were a bit conflicted by it. George Harrison was certainly conflicted by it. He wasn't in favour. George was extremely working class, and to doff the cap and
he didn't like it.
But they all bought into it. Mm-hmm. They all bought into it. Even Lennon, it may well have stuck in his throat, but I think even John was a pragmatist as well as being slightly rebellious, because he recognised that in order for them to achieve their goals, then sometimes there's been a compromise.
How did they cope with Lennon? I mean, the other three. I mean, also the manager Epstein, but particularly the other three members of the band. How did they cope with him when he went off on one? It must have been really difficult.
I think they gave him some space, but these were four guys. They were four guys, and somehow or other they managed to find an accommodation within each other. I mean, I think they were a genuine band of brothers. I genuinely believe that they were extremely tight.
I mean, the same with example with Simon and Garfunkel. By the end of their first period together, they could hardly bear to be on stage with each other. They hated each other.
I think for the majority of it, until it wasn't, these guys were really tight.
Okay.
I like
so
my
them against the they were tight together, and the rest were all exterior.
With Elvis, there's only Elvis, but with these guys, then they could act as human shields for each other, and if anybody got too big headed, then the other three would bring them back down to earth in a sense.
But
I think
Lennon they'd have to give Lennon some slack. They'd have to give.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, John could be acerbic, but the other side, he was a welter of contradictions.
Okay.
And I think sometimes that but sometimes there's a famous story where if he was having a disagreement with Macartney and he could be quite. I mean, his honesty veered close to masochism. And he would just lower his glasses and say, "It's only me."
Oh, yeah.
It's only me. So I think there was a definite connection between them.
Nice.
And that connection, by the way, I think is
only me, the guy you've
going
known
today.
Since after school.
But even today, that connection is still there because McCartney now tours and he's got all his Lennon images in the backdrop. Yeah. And I think today that he still misses him.
Did McCartney resent that it was Lennon and McCartney, not the other way around?
There was that agreement was let me get this right. That agreement was agreed in 1963 at a meeting whereby Lennon and McCartney went to Brian Epstein's house and there was a lawyer there and it was all very murky and shit. You must remember these are young guys.
Aye, they're young
right? And
boys for Liverpool.
they've got no experience of legal matters or financial matters. And it had already been carved up by the time Paul went to the meeting that the songwriting credit would be Lennon McCartney. And of course he said, well, I quite like McCartney Lennon. And it was a difficult standoff. If you look at Please Please Me, the album, there are a couple of credits on it which are actually McCartney Lennon. They're not Lennon McCartney.
And that was prior to it being sorted.
But at the time, the thing with John is that he was a very strong personality, and he was the leader of the band, and John was always the leader of the band. Even now, he's still the leader of the band. And John's the sheer power of John's personality. John got his way because John shouted the most. and so it became Lennon
in politics. I've never encountered that.
It became Lennon McCartney, and I think that's correct. Incident. We all know which songs,
of course,
by and large, were written. I mean, Paul McCartney could never have written "I Am the Walrus."
I Am the Walrus. Right. No.
In the same way that John could never have written "Yesterday."
No, that's right.
So, but
definitely with some of them, "Fool on the Hill" is actually
that's a Paul song.
It's actually Paul, isn't it? Yeah, because the
but
lyrics sound like they should be Lennon.
It did rankle with Paul down through the years, and on one of his live solo albums, he did ask Yoko Ono for permission to reverse the credits, and she refused. But
is she the one that broke up the Beatles? Go on, is she?
Definitely not.
No,
definitely.
George Harrison broke up the Beatles.
Definitely not.
No. So you exculpate her.
A whole range of reasons for it.
I'm going to go out to the. I've got tons more questions, but I want to bring in the audience, and I'm sure there's hands raised. If a microphone could go to our friend over there, please, first of all, and then I'm looking for other hands raised as well. Yes, please. And there's one there. Thank you. Yes, please.
There. Nice to see you, Brian. I was starting primary school in '63, and I want to
everybody's getting the calculators out now quickly.
Say a little bit more about how much they were a reflection or drove some of the changes.
Lovely.
I can remember in '63 going to school and feeling like the richest person in the world. Now, I've maybe truncated my personal history.
Forgive me, where were you going to school at the time?
Kilsyth.
Oh, right.
Kilsyth. And that was our music. I can remember aged 5, 6, 7, we would play in a playground. We would make up our own Beatles bands. We sang their music.
Wow.
But there was a real sense of optimism. I mean, when I look back, we lived in a room and kitchen. My mum finally had 7 children. We shared an outside toilet with another family, lived on top of a factory. But council houses were going to be built. You could really feel that as a child. It's just that overarching sense of richness and optimism. You had 1965, Jenny Lee doing the first white paper for an arts policy. So, and you had comprehensive education coming in. So I wonder how much there was just simply serendipity. The Beatles emerged from that, or did they help shape it? It'd be really interesting to hear you say maybe a bit more about that.
What a superb contribution. Thank you very, very much indeed, Ken.
There's definitely an element of serendipity about it. Everything relies on, facts and circumstances, and all these stars aligning at the right time. And I said earlier that they might not have been the vanguard of change, but they were certainly in the crow's nest, shouting "Land Ahoy!" And I think the songs, I think it's the music. I think the first television appearance, proper national television appearance, was "Thank Your Lucky Stars" in January '63, and it was the first time really they had so many young people of what, maybe 15, 16, 14, 15, something like that. And I had seen them, and there was something about them that, and the songs reflected a certain optimism, and maybe that optimism is a sign of the times. And the songs were good, and they were happy songs, and you couldn't get them out of your head, if you think
And
of.
they were very well produced by the.
Well, that's the thing. There was a Praetorian Guard around them, which was Brian Epstein, George Martin.
Yeah.
I mean, who was the fifth Beatle? I have no idea. There's only four. But how many Beatles did it take to change a light bulb? 4. But George Martin's
influential,
role cannot be overstated. I mean, George Martin's idea to put the drums at the start of "She Loves You" and go.
Yeah.
So his influence is absolutely major. But I think the songs, it all comes down to the songs, and they did. There was maybe a new mood in the country. The Tories, the Conservative Party, had been in power for, I think, something like 12 years. I mean, you can go back to Winston Churchill in 52, 55, something. You're better qualified than me to talk about that. But Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister. But Hugh Gaitskell, the Labour Prime Minister, had died in January 1962.
Labour leader, yeah.
And so there was a changing of the guard when you mentioned the white heat of revolution.
Yeah.
There was a whiff in the air, the Profumo scandal. So the Beatles came along at a time when maybe young people were searching for something slightly different.
I mean, it was a period of transformation. Macmillan stood down, and Alec Douglas Hume took over, and Harold Wilson said, "There he is, the 16th Earl Hume." And Hume replied, "Well, I suppose if you like to say that, you're the 16th Mr. Wilson." But it didn't quite work. I remember Alec Douglas Hume many years later coming to speak in St Andrews University in Lower College Hall, where I eventually sat my finals. But he was coming to speak. Whole place was packed, and the token trot from St Andrews, we had one trot, and he was there. And he, what have you ever done for the working class people of this country? It was when you mentioned the specs. Hume pulled his specs down like that, and he said, "To date, my friend, a little more than you." And the entire audience left, right, away. That's the way, Alec, you give it to him. But he was out of time. He was, completely out of time. And this the 16th Earl Hume had to give up a peerage to get a constituency in Perth to become Prime Minister. It was just, a decade later, it would have seemed ludicrous. We have another question across from our friend here, please. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Could you say a little bit about the euphoria and sort of hysteria that accompanied some of their concerts?
Good.
The fans following them round. You talked about Shea Stadium when they were playing, but there was so much screaming that couldn't really hear what was being played, etc. And it strikes me as a bit of a contrast with the music, which was great music.
Yeah.
But a lot of these adolescent girls were just there to sort of scream and go crazy as fans.
You mean just the difference between them and what came before, or?
No, their behaviour, and it strikes me that we haven't seen concerts like that.
Interesting,
where
yeah.
People were going along without any inhibitions and screaming and shouting and.
So was it literally? It was literally a mania, wasn't it? A collective mania descended.
What was it that produced that? Which, to my mind, I'd never seen that ever before.
So they were screaming at John, they were screaming at Paul, and if they were really enigmatic, they were screaming at Ringo.
Yeah, I mean, psychologists could have a field day trying to analyse what was this social phenomenon.
But our friend is right. There's something descended, didn't it? There was a mood. Yeah.
I mean, it's something unspoken. It's like an electricity charge in a sense. It's something unspoken about. I mean, there were 4 of them, so I think maybe fans could. There were Ringo fans, there were Paul fans, and I think maybe that helped to spread their appeal more widely. But in terms of the actual phenomenon itself, it's really difficult to put your finger on it. I mean, radio. I mean, just young people just seem to latch onto that period. They were new, they were fresh. There was a vigour about them. There was a vim about them. They were cheeky, and also they were. I mean, Paul McCartney's a good-looking guy in his youth, and so there was something in each of them that appealed to so many different people. In terms of the actual phenomenon of Beatlemania, it's really. I mean, it could easily have vanished as quickly as it arrived.
And you trace in the book that they constantly thought that the next concert will be our last. Somebody they'll rumble us.
Ringo wanted to open a string of hairdressers. He thought this is never going to last. And George wanted to open a garage. But you know, it just, I mean, I think radio has got a lot to play, had a big part to play, because that was like the Bush Telegraph in a sense for young people, because, you know, and it just seemed to, you know, take off. It took on a life of its own in a sense, you know. But I mean, who would have thought? I mean, it only lasted for maybe 2 or 3 years, and it's now become everything's now something mania. It's become pop music's greatest prefix in a sense, or suffix rather.
But it's not true. It's not comparable to what our friend there is. I remember in '67, I was at school, secondary school in Dundee, standing at the top of Reform Street, and a chum went by, obviously carrying a record in a bag, and I said, "Hey Jude," and he just went, "Oh, what else?" You know, and it was the total dominance of them. Friend here had a question, please.
I wanted to ask, like many other Beatles fans were really enjoyed in the last...
That was John, by the way.
That's John, yeah.
few years, the Peter Jackson Get Back film and all the hours of that. And I wondered, as a sort of expert, if you always sort of hear kind of, I don't know, rumblings here and there, that there are some other big kind of like archives of film, maybe from Sgt. Pepper or even a bit earlier with like Revolver, or, you know, I don't know, George writing Taxman in 10 minutes, like the McCartney writing Get Back, sort of just comes off the end of his fingers kind of thing. If you know if there's anything like that out there.
I can tell you categorically there isn't.
Really?
Absolutely not. And the reason for that is because the studio at that time, like the 66, 67, was an inner sanctum and nobody got in. And these days, you know, there wasn't the same easy exposure or casual exposure to media that you have today, where you have 24, 25-hour media. And when these guys went into the studio, by and large, it was closed off.
Closed set, yeah.
A closed set. And so there's and it's a great shame. I mean, it would have been fantastic to see some of that material. They were the most photographed band in history. There are millions of photographs out there, but there's not very much in terms of film work. I mean, the nearest they came to it was when they actually did do David Jude for the David Frost show, and that was the first time they had been seen on any kind of stage, if you like.
Yeah,
since
of course they made films.
66.
Hard Day's Night, and what was the other one?
Well, they made Hard Day's Night, and they did Help.
Oh, Help, of course, yeah.
They did Help.
What did you make of Hard Day's Night? It was some say embarrassment, some say
like Hard Day's Night.
Some like Goon style humour, you know.
Well, the Goons were a big influence.
I know.
So I quite like Hard Day's Night. Is that product of its time.
Steptoe, the old Steptoe?
Yeah, Wilford Bramble.
Wilford Bramble, yeah, and they keep calling him clean. That's
you're all very clean. So you know
how clean he is. Was that ad-libbed or was that scripted? Probably.
Some of it's ad-libbed. You know,
yeah. George
George Harrison famously came up with the word grotty.
Oh.
Apparently, he claims that he didn't really. I don't think he. I think we'd remember George for more than just coming up with the word grotty. But there's not really much footage of these years at all, which is a shame in a sense. And you mentioned Get Back. I have to almost put my hands up when I watch Get Back, because
that's the concert on top of the roof, the closing concert.
I mean, if you watch Let It Be, the film, it's a kind of hard watch in a sense. And it's not very long. I was looking at something last night. It's not very long. It's only about an hour and 20 minutes. Anyway, I'm a great Lord of the Rings fan. I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan. Excellent. So when he took it on, I thought this is going to be good. But even for somebody like me, 9 hours is a tough watch. 9 hours, there's a lot of navel gazing goes on. And, you know, and they weren't in the best of situations, really. But I have to say, hand in heart, when I knew there was now going to be a documentary of my... what was it, And in the End book.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of interest in it. And then Peter Jackson did his, and I watched it. I mean, there's no way I can compete with that.
And Peter Jackson's thing was like the Ring cycle, you know.
When I watched
Wagner's music, it isn't as bad as it sounds, you know.
When I watched Get Back, I watched it through the cracks of my fingers, because I'd done a lot of research for that book. And the only way you can do these books is to speak to people who were in the room. Otherwise, if you're relying on second or third hand testimony, you know, it doesn't work. So I really did my best.
Something McCartney said later in life, you know, you guys, you all talk about John Lennon. You know, I actually knew John Lennon. I was in the Beatles. You don't know what you're talking about.
He gets quite irritated.
He gets very irritated. Let's talk about briefly about a bit about the personalities. I mean, they were projected by Epstein and by the publicists, but they also were protected. You know, John had to pretend that he wasn't married. Paul had to keep his relationship with Jane Asher secret. That must have been awful for them. Then they moved together into a wee flat in London and lost the Liverpool base.
Yeah, I mean, it was all to do with marketing. It's that old showbiz pop music ideas that if you say you've got a girlfriend, then your appeal to young women would have diminished.
Stop screaming,
which is a load of rubbish, really. I mean, John Lennon was 23 in 1963, so he's not a teenager.
No.
And I think they chafed against Brian's yoke in a sense.
And it really was a yoke, wasn't it? He wanted them.
He tried to keep them
like the civil service with ministers, keep them occupied all the time so they can't get up to mischief.
He did try and keep them on a firm leash.
Yeah.
But it did. I mean, it did eventually leak out that Lennon was married and had a child, and Jane Asher was a very well known actress at the time. I mean, it's not like a paparazzi now every pouncing out of a corner, but it was well known. But they had there was a lot of friendly journalists, and if you didn't want to lose your seat in the groovy train as opposed to the gravy train, then you had to play by certain rules. So there were lots of things and lots of indiscretions and lots of cups of tea that were never reported by the media at the time, in order that everybody stays on side.
What about the Lennon with Cynthia? Was he did he treat her badly or? I
think he did.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can sugarcoat it.
Even given the need to protect him and protect the band and protect the image.
I don't think you can sugarcoat it.
He didn't go back very often.
It would be extremely hypocritical to try and dress that up as a marriage that just went south. I think she was very important to him. She was there for the early formative years. He wasn't at home because he's either in the studio or he's on the road. Yeah. So, there's no doubt that, his first child's early years, his formative years, he didn't see his dad very often, very much. So the bottom line...
That lead McCartney to write Hey Jude's meant to be Hey Jules, isn't it?
Well, actually, McCartney, I mean, Joey and Lennon said that felt Paul was more of a father to him than John. It's an interesting dichotomy, if you like.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can sugarcoat John's
Did the others feel that
behaviour.
their personal life had been invaded, or did they just sacrifice that for the sake of the band and marketing and fame and fortune?
I think the band came. It was Beatles first, and Cynthia next. But she was very important to him, and a formative year. I mean, John could easily have gone off the rails quite substantially,
Tracks some occasions where some conflicts. One conflict at a party in particular where he was indescribably rude to another participant.
This was Paul McCartney's. Ironically, Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party. Gee. Lennon was a nasty drunk.
Okay.
And I'm a great John fan. I'm a huge John fan. But you can't cover up some of his more obvious human defects. I mean, he was human like everybody else, but he was a nasty drunk, and he had a sort of viper-like tongue. It was nasty. And at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, and I know we'll maybe come on to that, but it wasn't long after he came back from the notorious holiday with Brian Epstein.
Let's talk about that.
And Bob Wooler was the DJ at the Cavern.
Bob Wooler, that was
he had certainly been one of their most avid cheerleaders. And he made some kind of cutting, sarcastic remark to Lennon, "How was the honeymoon, John?"
Yeah.
And the red mist just descended. And it's ironic because that was the first night that Jane Asher had met McCartney's family, and it was McCartney's 21st birthday party.
Yeah.
And Lennon completely ruined it. Now, the interesting thing is that, when you look at the millions upon millions of words that have been written about this band, nowhere will you find any criticism from Paul of John and his conduct. And it's clear to see, but Paul never, ever criticised them.
And is that personal friendship, or is that protecting the
Well, I think that speaks to there was a definite loyalty. The Beatles, in a sense, are an everyman band. They speak to the human condition, which is, you've got this great friendship, you've got love, you've got loyalty, you've got conflict. But I always found that interesting that McCartney never criticises Lennon for his social indiscretions. Not off the top of my head, anyway.
Okay, let's get some more questions from the audience. If there's a hand or at least a finger gently raised there, raise your hand, sir, and the microphone can come your way. Is there a mic available? we've lost our. Who was doing the mic?
I can talk loudly if you want.
That would
Yeah, I can hear you
that would
fine.
be fine. Yes, on you go.
The effect of Brian Epstein's death, do you think that enabled the creativity that happened in the second half of their career as a band?
Oh, that's that. Oh, that's,
I don't think Brian had any influence on their creativity. I think that was completely separate. What his death did do was to leave them rudderless. These guys are four musicians, and that's what they do best. And they're not businessmen, but they thought that maybe their egos had, got a bit out of control, and they thought they could become businessmen. And I think that's where the cracks begin to appear in the fabric of the Beatles, not musically, but away from music. They were trying to put together this great conglomerate called Apple.
yes.
Not that Apple, but that Apple.
Yeah, yeah.
And they weren't equipped to be businessmen. They weren't equipped to look after the millions and millions of pounds that are funneling through the system.
Yeah.
So they needed somebody. I mean, Brian's death, he's 27. I mean, it's interesting, Brian Epstein's only 5 years older than Lennon.
Yeah.
Really, 4 years. I mean, but it's a chasm. If you placed them side by side, you would think that Brian was he, when 15 years.
You discuss this in the book at various points as well. Was he financially astute and acute, or was he pretty rotten at that sort of thing? You trace, to be fair, you trace both sides of that argument in the book.
No, he was completely naive when it comes to business because there's no precedent. There's no precedent, for what happened.
Because they were so huge and so gigantic so
1963.
quickly. Yeah.
Post 1963. And just to return to that
the deal
point,
on merchandise, you trace that.
I'll come on to
please,
come on to that. Just to answer that question.
Yeah.
That when Brian died, there was a sense of. I mean, Lennon said we've had it. He thought we've had it. Expletive removed, and it was a shock. I mean, he was only 27 or something like that. And I think it's maybe hard for us now to gauge how much of a shock that would have been. So they were cast adrift because Brian did everything for them.
Yes.
He did everything. All they had to do was turn up in the studio, sit down with George Martin and work out and everything else outside that bubble, he took care of everything. And I think that was
what's your overall verdict on Epstein? Did he drive them too hard? But then on the other hand, he did break them into the American market after months of
I think he was
years of trying.
Absolutely essential. I'm not saying that they would have been a success without Brian.
Okay.
But he was naive. And the only reason he's naive, Brian, is because I'm sure my Brian's correct in the right order here.
Fine.
It's because it had never happened before. And just to put that in some kind of context for you, that after the Palladium gig in the end of 1963, and on the verge of going to America, then they decided that there was merchandising requests coming in from hankies, bags, donuts, and they were overwhelmed with this
a Ringo
manage.
donut. That sounds quite good.
A Ringo donut.
That would be good. I'd like a Ringo donut.
Women's, young girls' tights that would scare horses, apparently. And there were all sorts of things came in, and all of a sudden they were under siege from hustlers, hucksters, merchandisers. And how do you deal with that if you've never had to do it before? And millions of pounds is at stake here. So they had to find a way to devolve that element of it.
And I mean, Epstein went on holiday, as it was described with Lennon, and it was regarded as being an insult to Cynthia.
Well, it was.
Yes, it was.
Julian Lennon was only a couple of weeks old, and Lennon went on holiday with Epstein, and Epstein's homosexuality was illegal in the sense that that he could have been prosecuted and jailed at that time, and it was an unspoken thing among them. I mean, they all knew, but young lads, locker room mentality. Yeah. But when John went on holiday with Brian to Spain, it kind of raised the stakes a wee bit. Now, my own personal view is if there was a liaison, shall we call it, between them, there's only two people and they're both dead.
They're both dead.
So the truth of it will never be known. And anyway, who cares nowadays? Who cares? But again, it speaks to, we talked earlier on about the credits, Lennon McCartney. The consensus from the other three, especially Paul, was that this was an opportunity again for John to ingratiate himself with the guy who was the manager of the band and say, if you want this band to go places,
it's me.
then I'm the guy to go to.
I'm the man.
So, but it was a strange thing, and it was insulting to Cynthia.
Let's take another couple of questions from the audience. There's a hand raised at the far side, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. It's what a speed, top notch. No, I know that there's a mic coming your way, and our friend has had to run. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Brief question: was drugs good or bad for the Beatles?
Oh, definitely good. Definitely good. They would not have been able to write. I mean, they were lucky in that there was maybe they pulled themselves back from too much before they get into Sid Barrett territory and all that. But the drugs were definitely good for them within certain parameters. A song like Tomorrow Never Knows has got a great lyrical element. Lucy in the Sky, obviously.
So you don't think Lucy in the Sky with that?
No, I don't.
About the wee girl's picture. No, I don't think so.
I think Lennon was always honest. I mean, whatever his faults. I mean, if it did spell out LSD, he would just have said it.
Aye.
So, but in terms of absolutely, I'm not here to advocate the use of cups of tea, as Ringo always called them, with lots of cups of tea. But yeah, I think the drugs at the time, but I mean, drugs then and drugs now, it's a different kind of scenario. But yeah, I mean, I think they were good for them until they got fed up with them. I think LSD was a fad, a passing fad, and they didn't stick it very much. George Harrison always talks about that you could distill it and put it in formaldehyde, and it was like rope. It had rotted, and he said, all of a sudden I thought, I'm putting this in my brain.
This in me, yeah.
And I don't fancy that. But in terms of creativity, absolutely. Would have been Sgt. Pepper without LSD? It's an argument, a compelling argument to say probably not.
It was a belief at the time of an alternative reality, complete tosh, but there we are. It was a belief at the time. Any other questions from there's a hand raised at the back there, please. Yes. Thank you. I'm going to get time for a couple more from the audience and then I'll close. But yes, please.
Thanks, Ken. As someone with a lived experience of that period and still got the belt marks in my hand from Duggan's school to come up to see them in Glasgow, get cut out the next day. I'm interested in just how the music developed and the writing.
Good.
When you think about the first 4 albums, it was real cross-dimension because there's a lot of Americana in there when you think back to it. Blues influences, rock influence coming across, almost 50-50 in terms of the songs that were on those almost the first 4 albums from my memory without going back to look at. It's when they began to develop and what did it. Maybe LSD had a big part for Sgt. Pepper and so on. I just wonder if you got any thoughts on how that developed in terms of the band as a whole, because it was a whole. That's a nice thing about it.
Very, very good question.
I mean, the sophistication of the albums from Please Please Me to Abbey Road is like a quantum leap, really. I almost
do you like Let It Be, or do you not regard it as a Beatles?
I like Let It Be. I mean, there are bits of it I could lose, but I'm probably more Abbey Road guy.
Much more for me as well.
I used to split them into 3 different camps. You had the boy band, in a sense. I mean, you want to talk about boy bands, take that, give me a break.
Yeah.
There's only one boy band in it, and that was the Fabs. So you've got the first maybe 3 or 4 albums, which is like pop music and distilled pop music. Then you've got them becoming sort of from Revolver through Pepper, Mystery Tour, and they're these kind of hippie avatars in a sense.
Do you like Mystery Tour?
Mystery Tour's got Strawberry Fields Forever on it.
It does, but the film
and where else are you going? And where else are you going to see John Lennon singing "I Am the Walrus"?
There is that true. There is that.
And then the last part from the White Album through to Abbey Road and Let It Be, they become more full-blooded rock band in a sense. So the progression is incredible, really. I can't think of another band which had that quality of progression quite the same way.
Do you think they were really, really good musically? They were good artistically. They were good in projections. I mean, you get 1 or 2 musical snobs that say, they can't play like Cream, they can't play like Led Zeppelin, they can't play like Pink Floyd. But they're up there musically. George Harrison especially was a real...
I think they were musically perfect for that band.
Okay. And that music and their
Paul McCartney can be an egotistic person. about everything except Lennon used to say he's egotistic about everything about himself except for his bass playing.
Yeah.
And his bass playing is he's an unbelievable bass player.
Good, yeah.
Even today,
He's really
you know, his skill on that instrument, and of course he inherited it by accident.
Yeah.
But as a bass player, he's nothing short of magnificent. John Lennon as a rhythm guitar player, hard to beat.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah.
George George isn't flashy. He's not Clapton.
No, he's not Clapton. He's not Hendrix. He's not Jimmy Page. He's
But
just
when you
not-
listen
he's not
to
as good.
when you listen to what he brought to that band, I think he's unbelievable. I think
Okay.
And then of course I'm just going to come on very controversially. I'm a great Ringo fan. You know, I think he's an incredible musician. Brian and I were talking earlier about the famous quote that John attributed to John Lennon when he was asked about what was it? Is Ringo the greatest?
Was he the best drummer in the world? He wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles.
And of course
Apparently, it's not true. I thought it was true.
that's become urban myth because of a Jasper Carrot sketch.
Oh, wow.
And it went, as they say nowadays, all the young things say it went viral. But you never hear other drummers criticise Ringo. And again, I always liken the band, Brian, to four sides of the same square. And if you take one of them away, it doesn't work. I know Lennon and McCartney wrote the songs and George, but if you take Ringo away, it's not the same band. It's not the same band.
They gave Ringo one song per album, didn't they? You know what was it? Octopus's Garden.
I like Octopus's Garden. I'm a great fan of that.
And
But I'm a great Ringo fan, and I think he was an unbelievable drummer. And you never hear other drummers criticise him.
better than best.
People like better than best.
Yeah.
But people like Phil Collins and Neil Peart and Dave Grohl, they all look to Ringo as the sort of a template for what should a drummer for a band like the Beatles should be.
We talked earlier about the global culture. Was it genuinely a cultural revolution that they were part of, or helped instigate, or is that is that the verdict of what's good God? It's 60 years. What a depressing prospect. Is it the
when you talk about the 60s, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Oh, of course, yeah.
So in that sense, I mean, we shouldn't really be sitting here talking about a band that broke up more than 64 years ago.
Yeah.
It's really extraordinary that we are, and that's maybe testament to that, as I talked about earlier, the mystique, the enduring mystique, and the mythology and the mystery attached to them. But at the end of the day, it's the music that survives as much as anything. And I think certainly Cracking America was a
gigantic,
huge element
Yeah.
to it. And once America, that was the floodgates. Even Australia.
What was that program they played on? The Ed Sullivan, wasn't it?
Ed Sullivan show.
I've seen the things. Ed Sullivan looks completely bemused as to what the hell is going on here. He looks completely baffled. He
does, because he looks like an old guy, really.
He looks.
He's an old guy. But I mean,
You're losing your audience there again. No.
Well, I'm an old guy now.
I have the.
I'm a lot older than old Stoneface was then.
I've got time for one more question from the audience, if there is one. Is there a hand raised? Yes, please. Yes, thank you. Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, please. Thank you.
I'm just here to ask, what effect did the Beatles have on your life?
Great. Now, were you around in '63? I'm being big. Thank you for an excellent question. What effects did the Beatles have on you and your life?
Oh, absolutely massive.
Great question.
I mean,
Thanks.
I love the music. I can go from Sinatra to Schubert, from Mozart to Metallica, from the Beatles to Beethoven. Just don't ask me how many hits Beethoven had. So massive influence for me. I always think that no matter what age you are, and it's interesting that you're a younger person, but I think there's something in the songs that there's an everyman quality to them, and there's something in the songs that no matter what age you are, certainly when you were younger, and no matter what you were going through in your own life, it could be teenage angst or teenage love or some garbage like that. But there was always something in some of the songs that you felt spoke to you personally.
Yes.
That you could really identify with. And if you want a bottom line answer to a question, the songs make me happy.
And continue to make you happy as
even today. There's a sort of trickle down, and they become history's greatest legacy band.
Are we looking back at them, or are we looking back at what we were at the time and things we remember from the time and not long afterwards?
Well, maybe the 60s was a nicer period to grow up in, maybe, but But they were certainly at the head of a cultural wave and a social change in attitudes and social mores.
Was there a Mersey sound? There's some debate about that, whether it was just there was the Beatles and then there was all these other hangers-on, particularly in the Epstein stable.
Well, it's a convenient label, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
It's a convenient label. But there were a lot of good bands come out. I mean, Jerry and the Pacemakers. The thing about the Glasgow Concert Hall, when they were banned, the next band up in the concert hall would have been Jerry and the Pacemakers, and a less confrontational band you couldn't possibly think of at the time. So there was definitely a Mersey sound, but short-lived. I mean, there's only... Cilla Black was part of that movement as well, and she did very well. And again, it speaks to Brian Epstein's influence as a pioneer, in a sense.
But they were pioneers in other ways. They insisted on the singles. That was probably George Martin. Insisted on the singles and the albums being completely separate. The singles were issued
2 albums a year.
Yeah.
4 singles a year. That was the
separate. The singles aren't necessarily from
singles, not on the albums.
Like Strawberry Fields isn't on.
No, it was on Mystery Tour, but that's not quite the same.
That doesn't.
It's not quite the same because they thought that if they thought they were ripping off the fans if they had singles and then put the singles on the albums.
Yeah.
So there was a.
And now they don't worry at all. There
was a separation.
4 or 5 singles from each album. Friends, I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. That was absolutely superb. Ken's going to be upstairs signing copies of the Shake It Up Baby, The Rise of Beatlemania and the Mayhem of 1963. I cannot recommend it enough. It's absolutely superb. And in that spirit, will you join me in thanking Ken McNAB, please? Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay. I was just going to say finally, and again, thanks to you all for coming. But I think the long since past the audition. I always like to, for those of you who know that reference, that long ago the long past the audition. And I think, and we talked about Mozart and individuals like that. Well, we'll be talking about the Beatles in 200 years. Well, you and I won't be talking about them, but I think there'll still be a.
You think John Lennon was cheeky? Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had his moments as well. I can tell you, friends. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. I'm going to have to do a Benny Hill here to get out of the door. Here we go.